Hi everybody. Over the last 6 months or so, quite a few of you have been asking in the comment sections of the various videos that I've been posting, can you do some more list videos? So previously I'd done favourite Western movies, favourite sci-fi movies, top 50 action movies or whatever. I've done those kinds of videos, and some of you who have asked for more lists because you liked some of the movies that you got put onto, I presume. Well, anyway, I've put together another list. Well, actually, I put this list together about maybe a year, 18 months ago, and then stored it in a cupboard and forgot about it. And that is a list of my top 70 musical albums of all time. I was going to do it as a top 100, but I made this list about a year or 18 months ago, stored it in a cupboard and forgot I even had it, and I just discovered it today and thought, oh, I think I'll do a quick video on that, but I'd only done up to 70 albums. Now, I haven't included movie scores on this. These are just purely music albums, because if I was going to get into movie scores, I would have to add at least another 50 albums to this collection. Before we get into it, this is a personal list. I'm not claiming in any way, shape or form that these are the best albums of all time or that they have the most artistic integrity. They're just the albums mainly that I've listened to the most in my time. That's been my primary criteria. So there might be an album on here which you might think that's just commercial crap, but the fact that I listen to it so much means that I've elevated it. And I'm not pretending that I cover all kinds of different musical tastes. There will be a lot of variety in this list, but there's going to be certain genres that I almost entirely skip because I'm not familiar with them enough. There's going to be certain musical eras that I'm not familiar with. You're not going to find much from the 1940s or 50s on this list because I'm just not familiar with enough music from then. You're also not going to find many albums from the last 10 years, if any, because I basically stopped listening to a lot of new music quite a long time ago. Because I'd had thousands and thousands of albums and I just didn't really feel the need to buy any more. So yeah, it's just a very personal list, and no need to get upset if albums that you like are not on the list, because you are totally entitled to post your own list, and your list would be just as respectable as mine. First item on the list at number 70 is Portishead's first album, which was called Dummy, and it was very much a chill out album, but with a very dark edge to it. And I think the standout track for me on that was one of the singles called Sour Times. Number 69 was Faith No More's Angel Dust. Pretty good rock album from early 1990s, around about the era where grunge was starting to take over, but I thought Faith No More were doing some very good stuff at that time. I was not a big fan of grunge. I'm still not, but Faith No More made a pretty damn good album here. Standout tracks, Midlife Crisis and A Small Victory. There's other good ones on there, but those are my two favourites. Number 68 is a band from my home city of Liverpool called Space. They did an album called Spiders, which in the early 90s was a massive hit album, and the standout track on there was Female of the Species. Marvellous song. If you're not familiar with the song or the album, go and look up Space, Female of the Species here on YouTube. Great song. Number 67, Peter Gabriel's album just called So. This was a mid-80s or late 80s album, I can't remember the exact year. Really good album, standout tracks on it, Sledgehammer and Big Time, and the music videos for both of those are pretty fucking awesome. Number 66 is the Sneaker Pimps. A lot of you won't have heard of this, but they did an absolute belter of an album in the early 90s. And yeah, pretty much chill out stuff, not as dark as Portishead, but virtually all the tracks on this album are good. It's not very often you get an album where every track is good. Well, this one came pretty close to that. Number 65, Motley Crue, Dr. Feelgood. Cheesy 80s, sort of glam rock garbage, not exactly creative. Well, actually, I'll take that back. Glam rock was an art form of its own, and just because people look down on it doesn't mean that it didn't take a lot of effort to do. Well, anyway, Motley Crue did a good, fun album here, and I think the standout track for me was a fast one called Kickstart My Heart. Number 64, Skid Row, Slave to the Grind. Another sort of cheesy-ish sort of rock band from the 80s, but with Slave to the Grind they went a bit heavier. Standout track on that for me was the heaviest one called Mud Kicker. Number 63, goth album, Sisters of Mercy, Floodland. Really good tracks on this. This Corrosion, Lucretia, and another track that was called either Dominion or Mother Russia, something like that. All three of those were standout tracks, and I couldn't really pick out which was the best out of those three. Number 62 is a Japanese band called the Mad Capsule Markets, and this was sort of a techno industrial punk type band, you know, very commercial, but you know, a good solid fun album. And I used to pass this album on to a lot of other friends who were into similar things, and they'd all come back and say, oh yeah, really enjoyed that. Number 61 is Simple Minds, Real Love, going back to the 80s, you know. A good basic sort of commercial, middle of the road, rock pop type album. Standout tracks would probably be, I think Let There Be Love was a good track on there. And I think there was a slow one on there called Banging on the Door, which was quite nice. Number 60 is Tricky, who used to be in Massive Attack. It's his album called Max and Quay. You know, good sort of mellow, sort of chill out album with a dark edge, very funky. Number 59, I've put another Tricky album, which is Pre-Millennial Tension, which I liked a little bit better. I think a lot of people liked Max and Quay better, but I liked Pre-Millennial Tension better for some reason. Not sure why. I think it had more standout tracks for me. Number 58 is the rock band Ministry with, I think it was a late 80s album called Rio Grande, or it might have been in the 2000s, I can't remember which. Rio Grande was, Ministry went pretty hardcore on this. It's not so much an industrial Ministry album like they were used to doing in the 80s, but yeah, very, very heavy and fast album. Pretty damn good, loads of good tracks on it. Standout track on it, I think for me, would definitely be the one called Great Satan. That's an absolute blast, that song. Number 57, Talking Heads, Speaking in Tongues. 80s album. The standout track for me in this one is a song called Swamp, which is a very funky track that was used in the party scene of the movie Risky Business. Number 56 is Eminem's Marshall Mathers album. I haven't listened to this for a long time, but I was really into it when it came out, like everybody was. Standout track for me was one called Criminal. Number 55, another album I haven't listened to for many years, which is Limp Bizkit's Significant Other. You know, a nice fusion of rock and rap, and I thought it was much better than the Chocolate Stars album that they followed up with, although that one had some decent tracks. But Significant Other I liked quite a lot. Standout track that I can remember for that is Break Stuff, because I used to jump around to that in heavy metal clubs. Number 54, hardly any of you will have heard of this, but this was an Australian band called The Poor, and they did an album called Who Cares. It's just a straight rock album, nothing unusual about it, but a good solid album, very catchy. Number 53, a sort of semi-industrial electro metal album called Darkest Days by a band called Stab and Westward. Standout track on the album for me was the very last one, which was a moody piece called Waking Up Beside You. Number 52, Pink Floyd's The Wall. This is an album that I've got a funny relationship with because it sort of takes me back to the old stoner days from my teens. And I wasn't a very happy chap in my teens, and the album isn't very happy either, so I find it very depressing in itself and because of its associations for me in the past. But The Wall, you know, there's a lot of variation on the album. Of course, the movie being so interesting makes it sort of accessible as well, because you watch it and you think of the movie. Standout track for me would probably be Run Like Hell. Number 51, Coverdale Page, and the album was just called Coverdale Page. So this was David Coverdale from Whitesnake and Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, and they got together and made this album, which was a straight sort of bluesy type rock album, and it's good, it's decent, you know, it doesn't break the mold, but it's a solid album. Standout track for me is one called Over Now. Number 50, Skid Row, Subhuman Race. Skid Row fans tend to hate this album. Personally, I think it's great. This is where they went a hell of a lot heavier. They were trying to keep up with the kind of grungy, more darker metal that was coming out in the 90s, but yet they managed to, for me, maintain some of their edge. And frankly, I think this album knocked a hell of a lot of the competition away. But because they were an 80s band, all the kids weren't going to latch onto it because, you know, they were known for doing the cheesy 80s stuff. But Subhuman Race is a solid album. Most of the tracks on it are really good. Standout tracks for me would be either Beat Yourself Blind or the title track Subhuman Race is really fast. And there's a really good moody one on there called Frozen. Most of the tracks on it are really good, so, you know, hard to pick a favourite really. Number 49, Fear Factory, Remanufacture, not Demanufacture. Demanufacture was the original album, which is a sort of industrial metal album. Very fast, very thrashy. Remanufacture was the sort of dance remixes of the songs, and I actually like it better than the original album. I can't remember which tracks stood out on it. There was some really good slow moody ones near the end of the album, but I can't remember the names offhand. Number 48 is Bjork's first album, the debut album. Can't remember the tracks, but most of them were good on this album as well. Number 47, Wu-Tang Clan, 36 Chambers. Good old Wu-Tang. There was some really catchy ones. There was there was a track that stood out to me. Oh yeah, that was it. Protect Your Neck was a great track off this album. Number 46, Smashing Pumpkins with their double album called Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. Loads of good tracks on this. I think there was one called XYZ or YYZ, and another one called something like Where Fear Treads or something like that. I can't remember, but anyway, most of the album was really, really good. Number 45, another Smashing Pumpkins album called Siamese Dream. It was the first one that they did. I think Melancholy's got the better songs, but Melancholy's also got more filler material. Siamese Dream was a more, you know, if you took the best tracks off Melancholy and just put them into one album, I think it would be better than Siamese Dream. But Siamese Dream was a solid album, first one that they did, and I can't remember the name of the tracks, but there was quite a few good ones on there. Number 44, Aphex Twin, Drux, another double album. Loads and loads of good tracks on here, and I can't remember the names of them. Oh, except there was one standout track which I think was called Melt Phase or Melt Face 6. A really freaky, fast one, but very sort of like catchy and unusual. Number 43, Led Zeppelin 4. Finally getting some much older stuff here. Solid album, very famous. Pretty much all of you will have heard it. My favourite track was When the Levee Breaks. Number 42, hardly any of you will have heard of this. Acumen Nation with an album called Psycho the Rapist. This was quite a fast and heavy, intense industrial metal album, and it never really got a big release, but I like it because I liked almost every track on it. It had a sort of its own sort of unique sound. Standout track on there for me is one just called No Imagination, very fast one. Number 41, Megadeth Rust in Peace. Remember this one? Those of you who are metal fans should be familiar with this. Standout track for me, I mean, I think for most people the standout tracks was Hangar 18, fast one, and the opening track, which was called Holy Wars. That was it, yeah, Holy Wars. Holy Wars is a freaking awesome track. That and Hangar 18, I can't pick the best out of those, but they were both great. Number 40, 9 Inch Nails, Pretty Hate Machine. Back when they were sort of commercial-ish, very sort of nice pop sound, but with a bit of a dark edge thrown in there, some pretty dark lyrics. Favourite track for me on there? Ooh, several good ones. Something I Can Never Have was a very decent, slow, moody track. But then Down In It was a great sort of pop song. Number 39, Aerosmith Rocks. 70s album. Almost every track on it was good, very old school. Standout track for me, either Nobody's Fault or the opening track, which was called Back in the Saddle. Number 38, Ministry, Psalm 69. This is where they started to incorporate a lot more rock, heavy metal elements in, but they still had a lot of industrial stuff going on there. Favourite track on this for me would be a long, slow song called Scarecrow. That's a marvellous piece. Number 37, DJ Shadow, The Private Press. Damn good album, and my favourite track on it would probably be, I think it was called Giving Up the Ghost. Number 36, and I keep having these artists back to back, is an album, but the album was referred to as being by Uncle, but actually DJ Shadow and James Lavelle were the guys who were behind the whole Uncle project. And it's the first Uncle album called Science Fiction. Good little album, lots and lots of good tracks on there, and I can't remember the tracks, so that you just have to go and check that out for yourself. Number 35, Duran Duran. This is going to be a weird one on the list, and a lot of you probably tell me to fuck off on account of this. Duran Duran's album called Liberty, which they released around about 1990, just when they were really losing their popularity and things like grunge were starting to come in and all the dark music of the 90s was starting to take over. This was not the right time to release the Liberty album, but as Duran Duran albums go, it's pretty good. There's a lot of very good tracks on there. If you like 80s cheesy Duran Duran, this one's got a lot of good tracks on it. I think my favourite on there was probably one called First Impressions, quite a fast one. Number 34, we're really bouncing around genres here. We're going from Duran Duran Liberty to Machine Head's first album called Burn My Eyes. This was massively popular, very heavy, really good drumming in this one. Standout track for me would probably be Old or Block, but there's so many good tracks on here it's hard to pick. Number 33, a very unusual one. Hardly any of you will have heard this, but it's well worth the listen. And this is a band called the Secret Chiefs 3, who were very musically skilled and very versatile. And they did an album called Book M. This is a weird mixture of Eastern and Western music. These guys throw together all types of different musical genres together in the one piece. This is the kind of music, it's kind of like rock music that you can imagine women belly dancing to. If you can imagine what that sounds like, check out Secret Chiefs 3, Book M. Number 32, Supertramp, 1970s album called Crime of the Century. Quite a few classic tracks on there, and it'd be hard to pick one as a favourite for me. Number 31, Michael Jackson, Bad. What? Well, yeah, this album had a hell of a lot of hit singles on it. I wouldn't say it was very consistent as an album, but man, it had some really good individual songs. And the best one for me was the very last one he did called Leave Me Alone, where he really had to go at the press. And even in his death, he still got people throwing all kinds of stupid accusations at him. See my videos on Leaving Neverland, the absolute bullshit that so-called documentary was. Load of garbage. They won't leave the fucking guy alone. Number 30 is Slipknot's self-titled album, which it's easy to assume is the debut album because it's the one that made them really famous. They had done other stuff before that. But for me, the self-titled album was very solid. Lots of pretty good tracks on there. Favourite one for me? Oh, it's hard to pick. There's quite a few good ones. Number 29, shifting genres again, The Happy Mondays, Pills, Thrills and Bellyaches. I think the best track for me on here was the second one called God's Cop, but there were several other tracks on here that were massive hits, but God's Cop was my favourite. Number 26, Stabbing Westward again. We had one of their albums earlier, and this is their first album called Ungod. The Stabbing Westward are typically looked upon as being a sort of Nine Inch Nails imitation band, but they were pretty damn good in their own right, and the first album is rock solid. It's fairly fast industrial rock music. There's one or two slowish tracks on there. The best track on there for me would probably be, I think it was the second track called Nothing. But most of the tracks on this album are very good. Number 27 is Recoil, which is Alan Wilder, who used to be in Depeche Mode, an album called Liquid. This would have made it higher up the list if the album had been more consistent. But the best tracks on here are so good that they elevated this album up to 27 on my list. Best track for me would be one called Breath Control. That song is a work of art. Really unusual musical style in this album. It's electronica, but it sounds incredibly organic. And it's pretty dark in a sleazy, funky way. Number 26, I haven't listened to this for a very long time, but I listened to it loads back in the day, was Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill. This was, I didn't like any of the albums she did afterwards. And looking back, she was a bit of a fucking moaner, to be honest. I mean, I don't listen to Pink Floyd's The Wall hardly ever because of all the moaning. Same with this album. But it was a solid album. It had loads of good tracks. Most of the tracks on it were really good. Favourite track on there? Hard to pick because there was quite a few good ones. Number 25, Marilyn Manson's Mechanical Animals. I wouldn't say there are so many individual tracks on this album that are really, really outstanding, but overall the album is very consistently decent. There's hardly any bad tracks on there. Favourite track for me? I remember Coma White being a really good one that stood out to a lot of people. I can't remember which was my favourite track. It wasn't Coma White, there was another one I really liked. But yeah, loads of good tracks on it. Number 24, Suede, Coming Up. Basic pop rock album from the 90s, but very consistent, lots of good tracks on it, and I can't remember the names of the tracks, but it was a solid album. Number 23, Marilyn Manson again with Antichrist Superstar, the album that made him famous. Marilyn Manson tends to get looked upon in quite a negative way, like he was just a sort of commercialist, deliberately provoking controversy. But with this album, he did really throw a hell of a lot of satire and critique at the issue of stardom, and ironically became a star in himself through doing this album. Best track for me? I don't know. Tourniquet was a very good track, but there were other ones in there that really stood out. Kinderfeld. Again, it's a very consistent album, loads of good tracks. Number 22, Duran Duran again, with the Wedding album, which I think is one of their most critically appreciated albums. The Duran Duran fans themselves tend to love it, and the critics liked it as well. They updated their sound a bit, they went a little bit more funky. Standout tracks for me were the last two tracks on the album. I think the very last one was called Sin of the City, very funky. And the one before that was called To Whom It May Concern. Both of those tracks were excellent. They saved the very best until the end of the album, as far as I was concerned. Number 21, Slipknot, The Subliminal Verses. Now, I know a lot of people hate Slipknot, and I don't like hardly any of the albums that they've done since the Subliminal Verses. And a lot of Slipknot fans don't like the Subliminal Verses because it's less heavy than the other albums. It's got a lot more variety. They actually did a lot of mellow stuff on this album. And I used to play a lot of people tracks from this album, that tracks that sounded very similar to the likes of Radiohead. And people who had no interest in Slipknot and didn't even take any interest in heavy metal, I would play them the mellow tracks off this album, not tell them who made the songs, and they'd be like, wow, what the hell is this? This is awesome. And then I'd tell them it was Slipknot, and they would have a look of shock on their face. Very, very varied album. For me, it's easily the best thing that they ever did, even though most Slipknot fans say it's the worst, and they are totally fucking wrong. Standout track for me was the opening one, a moody piece just called Prelude 3.0. Number 20, one that most of you won't have heard of, is I think this girl's from Norway. She's Swedish, I can't remember where she's from, but her name is Stina Nordenstam, and the album was called And She Closed Her Eyes. Pretty much every track on this is really good. She's got an unusual voice and unusual sort of mellow instrumentation to match her childlike, innocent voice. But, good songwriting, very unusual style to this album. It's definitely not for Slipknot fans either. Best track for me on this was the opening track called When Debbie's Back from Texas. Number 19, the John Spencer Blues Explosion with their album called Now I Got Worry. This album's an absolute blast. It's really raw, it's really good fun, good one to put on at parties. Saw them live, they were fantastic live. and most of the tracks on this are really solid. My favourite tracks on this were two that came near the end of the album, came next to each other near the end, called Can't Stop and Firefly Child. Brilliant songs. Number 18, Anthrax, The Sound of White Noise. I wasn't so much into the 80s Anthrax. They were okay, they were fast, you know. But Sound of White Noise, they went for this really punky, edgy, grindy sound that was quite unusual, and you know, they had a new singer and I liked his voice a lot better. Sound of White Noise is absolutely solid. I played this album to death when it first came out. All the tracks on it were really, really good. Best track for me would probably be either 1000 Points of Hate or Packaged Rebellion. In fact, I'd probably go for Packaged Rebellion as my favourite track on this. But, you know, my God, the other tracks on this album are just fantastic as well, so it's really hard to pick a favourite track. Number 17, an Icelandic band who most of you will never hear of, but I hope you go and look them up. They are called Quarashi, and they did this album, which I'm not even sure how you pronounce this, but I think it says Zenizes. And these guys are a kind of a fusion of, they sound a bit like the Beastie Boys, but they got a little bit of an industrial edge to them. Personally, I like them a lot better than the Beastie Boys, although I do like a lot of Beastie Boys tracks as well. Quarashi are this like fantastic band who, for me, all the albums that I've ever listened to from them, which is most of their stuff, I probably liked about 70 to 75% of the songs that they did, and that's an extremely high ratio. I'd probably put Quarashi in my top 5 favourite bands of all time. They don't exactly break the mould, but the quality of what they do and the number of different genres they mix in there are really solid. They're a very upbeat, happy band. You know, playing them at the beach would be awesome. And they're pretty creative as well. Sometimes they get some very unusual sounds into their songs. Yeah, they're fantastic. My personal favourite track on this album was one called Tambourine Cut. Number 16, Alice Cooper, The Last Temptation. And some of you will be, what the fuck, that album was a total flop. Well, it actually did get some reasonably good critical acclaim at the time. Personally, I thought it was by far the best album that Alice Cooper ever did. Again, you know, this was 1990 when a lot of people were shifting away from a lot of the rock and pop stars of the 1980s, and they were saying, fuck those guys, we want new stuff. And a lot of the bands from the 80s tried to adapt and put out stuff that the 90s crowd would like, and some of them did some fantastic albums, but of course they weren't considered to be the hip and trendy new thing, and so those albums wouldn't sell so well. But Last Temptation is solid. There's loads of good tracks on here. There's hardly any bad tracks at all from what I can remember. Standout tracks for me, probably the second track called Nothing's Free, fairly fast one, and a very famous track off this album which seems to be appreciated by just about everyone who hears it, called Stolen Prayer. And I think that was helped by the fact that Chris Cornell, I think he wrote that song, and then he and the Alice Cooper Band performed it. Number 15, Supertramp, Breakfast in America. Way back to the 1970s, we're changing eras again. This is just a frigging great album. Loads of good tracks on it. It's got its own unique sound. Standout track for me would probably be one called Oh Darling, which is one of the less famous songs off this album. But you know, there's so many good songs on here. How could you pick? But yeah, that was my personal favourite one. If you asked me in a different year, I might pick a different track. My only complaint about this album is that the drumming is very, very simple. With a little bit more tighter drumming, a little bit more exploration in the drumming, I think that could have helped give this album a boost, but it's really, really good as it is. Number 14, we've already had a Recoil album earlier called Liquid in this list. This is another Recoil album. Again, this is Alan Wilder, who was in Depeche Mode, and when he left, he started doing these Recoil albums, which were very dark and fluid and organic sounding. And this album's called Unsound Methods. All the tracks on this are really, really good. To pick a favourite one, I think probably the very last track on the album was my favourite. And that song was called Shunt. It's an instrumental piece, no lyrics, but it's the type of thing that would fit perfectly in like a David Lynch film or something like that. Very moody and very catchy. Number 13 is George Michael's Older. Now, a lot of people would look upon this and say, oh, hang on, George Michael, isn't that a bit commercial? Well, the thing is, George Michael did a lot of really fucking good stuff. You know, he did pop music, but he was very skilled at it. And when he did the Older album, he sort of branched out and went into the jazz direction. And it was great, you know, some really excellent songs on here. I can't remember the names of the songs offhand, but I remember being really impressed by this album and playing it quite a lot. Number 12 is the first Enigma album called 1990. Everybody was into this. Such a great chill out album with, you know, a lot of sort of enlightenment sort of themes, a very religious feeling album. You know, it's like a spiritual experience, and the whole thing is good all the way through. Number 11 is getting into some dance music here. The Shaman, Intact. The Shaman were like this sort of cheesy rave era, you know, dance act. But they did this one album that I absolutely loved called Intact. It was less cheesy than their other stuff for me. And for me, this was the model from which the Prodigy sprang. They were introducing little bits of rock here and there in this album. Solid album. Everybody I knew who had this album absolutely loved it. And pretty much all the tracks on here were really, really good. My favourite tracks on this are probably Hyperial, which is a very mellow one, which has got a lot of Evil Dead 2 samples thrown into it, which is quite funny. And another track called Lightspan. Number 10 is Censor with an album called Stacked Up. This album mixes together quite a few different genres, but it's mostly rap and rock. And you think, yeah. Well, everybody was sort of into Rage Against the Machine for mixing rock, rap and metal. But personally, I thought that Censor did it a hell of a lot better. They were a lot more inventive with it. And they mixed in some other styles. You get parts of this album that sound like Massive Attack. You get other parts of this album that sound almost like the Prodigy. You know, there's a real variety in this album. And the lead singer wrote some pretty solid lyrics for this album. Very political, but not too annoying. It just really solid album. Pretty much every track on it is really good. And Liam Howlett from the Prodigy absolutely loved this album as well. My favourite track on here would possibly be the heaviest piece on the album called Stubborn. But at the same time, there was a couple of tracks, one called The Key, which was a sort of mellow one, and one called Switch, which I think was a hit single, and that was sort of a more commercial rap song. All good stuff. Number 9 is Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin, with his solo album Fate of Nations. Pretty much all good tracks on it, very good instrumental style, very mellow, very sort of a maturing of Robert Plant, you know, from back in the rock days. But there's still some good solid riffage on this album as well. The final track on the album stood out to me a lot, and that one's called Network News. That's a friggin' great song, but there's so many other good songs on this album, it's hard to pick a favourite. Number 8 is Tina Turner's Private Dancer. And I know some of you are going to just be like rolling around, like, what the fuck is this guy talking about with these commercial albums? But hey, you know, I have thrown in a hell of a lot of very uncommercial and unknown stuff in this list as well. But Tina Turner's Private Dancer album was an absolutely solid piece of pop music. And it was one of the biggest selling albums ever. And it was one of the few albums that my parents listened to that I actually fucking liked. And I think the standout track for me was the opening track, which was a fast one called, was it Soul Survivor? It was called I Might Have Been Queen. That was the first track on the album. That was my favourite. But so many hit singles from this album as well, so really good. Now, number 7, we're switching complete genre again, is Sepultura's Roots. You know, Roots, bloody Roots. Fantastic album. I love the sort of really heavy, grungy feel of this album. I like it a lot better than the other Sepultura albums. I love the tribal feel of this album. It's so raw. Standout tracks for me, I think my favourite was a really grindy piece called Look Away, which was later on in the album. Number 6, Massive Attack's Mezzanine. We're changing genres quite a lot in this list, and yeah, this one is a very funny one to have next to Sepultura's Roots. Yeah, Mezzanine was a huge album, and it deserved to be huge. It was really, really damn good. So many great tracks on it. Favorite track for me, I think it was called Milk. It was a long, moody, mellow piece midway through the album. Yeah, moody and mellow, standard Massive Attack, but this one was especially moody and mellow. I think it was just called Milk. Number 5 is, oh my God, we're changing genres again big time. Cheesy 80s rock pop from the band Yes, and their album was called 90125. And this one had that huge hit single, Owner of a Lonely Heart, but the whole album was damn good on this one. There's not really any filler material here. Favourite track for me? Oh, it's so hard to pick. There's so many good tracks on here. Changes was a great song. Owner of a Lonely Heart was a great song. It Can Happen was a great song. And there's a really weird, slightly experimental piece at the end just called Hearts. And that's got some interesting stuff going on in it as well. Great album. And extremely well produced. Number 4, completely changing genres again, is the Gravediggers' first album, which I think in some countries it's called 6 Feet Deep, and in other countries it's called Nigger Mortis. This album absolutely is outstanding. I've listened to this album so many times, never get bored of it, love every bit of this album. It never ever bores me. It's so funny, the humour and detail that's gone into this album, and the lyrics are absolutely awesome. I don't listen to hardly any rap music these days, but Gravediggers is the one rap album that I will always latch onto as being one of my favourite albums of all time. And it's musically, I think this is a hell of a lot more skilled and a lot more creative than most rap albums. A lot of rap albums, they prioritise having all the wordplay, you know, the fast and intricate lyrics, but the music is often absolutely garbage. But in this album, there's a lot of creativity in the music itself. There's all kinds of samples from horror movies and things like that. It is awesome. Even if you don't like rap music generally, go and check out the Gravediggers album. But I can't really pick a favourite track on here. There's so many good ones. Number 3, Michael Jackson's Thriller. We all know this album. It was a massive, massive hit back in the day. And you just got to look back in awe and listen to the skill that's gone into this album. Track by track, just so many memorable tracks here and huge hit singles. It was just an amazing piece of output that he did there. And he actually branched, made a bridge between the rock audiences and the sort of rap and funk type audiences with the track called Beat It. That was a genre-breaking track that bridged those genres together. And number 2, we're switching genres again. 9 Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral. This is not an album you listen to for fun. It's so dark and it can be very depressing, but there's also a lot of upbeat stuff mixed into it. It's a very weird album. When I first heard this album, I hated it because it was so freaky and I found it really disturbing. But years later, I went back to it and gave it another few spins and I was like, wow, this is actually really fucking good. There's a lot of, on first listen, it's really dark and depressing and miserable, and but then as you get into it, there's a weird kind of beauty beneath the surface in this album, and a catchiness to a lot of it. Favourite track for me would probably be an instrumental piece called Eraser. That's later on in the album. Not the type of album I listen to for fun, but I consider it to be a work of art. It's so unusual. And number 1, I go to this because it still blows me away, this album, whenever I hear it. And I've listened to it a hell of a lot, and sometimes I forget about it for years and then go back and then it's like, wow, this still stands up. Is The Prodigy, Music for the Jilted Generation. This album fucking blew people away here in Britain. Over in America, you guys didn't get onto The Prodigy properly until their Fat of the Land album came out, and that album was targeted at you guys in America. But Music for the Jilted Generation is the fucking best dance album ever. I mean, for me, nothing else comes near it. I think I had one other dance album on this list, which was The Shaman Intact. That one is incredible. But Jilted Generation is just sublimely created. Loads and loads of brilliant tracks on here. Loads of hit singles. Best track for me, though, is one that wasn't even released as a single. A really fast and long piece called Speedway. That song is an absolute blast. I remember the first time I heard it, I was just astounded at the skill that had gone into how that track had been constructed. Right, folks, well, there you go. That's my top 70 albums of all time. There's a hell of a lot of variation in this list. There's a hell of a lot of genres and musical eras that I've completely missed out because I'm not familiar with them or because I didn't like them. But I hope I've covered enough stuff that a lot of you will have found maybe half a dozen albums on this list that sound like they might be interesting to you. And you might go and check those out and be just like blown away and be like, wow, that is awesome. I hope you get something off this list that's worth listening to. Like I say, this isn't a list of the best albums ever. It's not a list of the most artistically worthy albums ever. It's just a list of the albums that I've listened to the most and enjoyed the most, whether they were commercial or artistic or not. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. More lists hopefully on the way soon. If you haven't seen them, check out my lists of best horror movies, best action movies, best science fiction movies, that type of thing. I think the good thing about these lists is it points you people in the direction of things that you might like. Okay, see you later, folks. Bye bye.